So, today we're talking about knife skills. We're talking about different types of knives, how to sharpen the knives. We're going to go through different steps of cutting, what each knife's used for. We're going to kind of start A to Z of knives in general. First thing you can see here is I have an array of knives, and my favorite brand personally is Shun. Shun knives are handcrafted. They're absolutely fantastic. They have a nice Japanese steel where, while it requires to be sharpened more often, it actually stays, or it gets a much sharper edge to it. German steel is great. It's very rugged. It's very strong. It'll hold its sharpened for a while. But the Japanese steel, you can get a much finer edge on. So I love Japanese steel. These are the Shun Classics. These are kind of my favorite. They have a nice rounded edge and a little dimple here. I'm a righty, so it works really well for me with the right hand because it kind of fits into the crest of my fingers. For these knives now, this is a simple what's called a paring knife. And a paring knife, this is kind of your general utility knife for using things like cutting small vegetables. You want to peel something. Small dicing little things, cutting cherry tomatoes in half, stuff like that. The next knife is what's called a utility knife. And a utility knife is, same shape and idea of a paring knife, but it's longer. And this knife is great because this is kind of my go-to handy knife. I use this in place of a fillet knife. So now I use this knife for filleting fish. I use this for trimming up meat if I'm trimming short ribs or cutting steak or anything like that. I love this knife because it's very handy. It's light. It's got a slim blade. It's just very easy to work with and works really well. The next knife is the Nakiri. By the way, I beat up all my knives, so these are all nice and dull so that I can actually show you how to sharpen and we can do a proper, test of everything. But I don't recommend you grab your knife like this. Probably not very smart. So the Nakiri knife is great for vegetables. Again, this is one of those knives, it has to be what you're comfortable with, and I've grown very comfortable with this, so I use this for a lot of slicing and chopping. But it's got to be something that works well. And you can see how many times I've used this because the logo is starting to fade away a little bit. The chef's knife, there's two different kinds. So I have a smooth blade chef knife, and then I have what's called a santoku. And that means it has dimples on here. And these dimples, when you're cutting something like, say, a tomato, you know how often it'll stick to the knife and then it starts, you keep cutting and it keeps sticking to the side of the blade. These little dimples help prevent that a little bit. Well, it's not foolproof. It definitely helps with that from sticking, which is really a great feature on a knife, and it's great to have. Some people don't prefer it. I actually don't have a preference. It depends on what I'm doing, but for finer chef knife work, I like a smooth blade. If I'm doing utility chopping, I'll go with something like this, which has the dimples. And then this guy, this is a cleaver. So, you see these in the horror movies and things like that. This is used for heavy duty work. So if I'm taking apart a pig and I need to get through a bone or a joint, this has a lot of weight. I mean, this thing probably weighs about 7-8 pounds. So I could take this and with force use it to end up getting a great inertia and coming in and cracking right through something big. This isn't made for chopping. This is a utility tool. And the cleaver is awesome. You see it in a lot of butcher shops. You see it, like I said, in a ton of horror movies. But the cleaver is it's an amazing tool to have. The other thing you can have is a hacksaw, a handsaw. You use a handsaw instead of a cleaver, and you can saw through the bones as well. This will, because the blunt force, splinter the bones a little bit, but it's great to have if you're comfortable using it. The carving knife, this is a very long, very sharp blade, and the point of this is to get long fluid motion on the meat when you're slicing it. So the carving knife, you don't force down, you don't rock down, you actually just glide and gently direct the knife as it goes through, and it's going to do the work for you. And then the last one that we're going to talk about today is the serrated knife, also the bread knife. Now, serrated knives have these little teeth, these little waves and hills on them, and they're very sharp. So a serrated knife, well, it's more difficult to sharpen. It's going to catch the food as you go through, and then those really sharp inserts inside are just going to right through the food. So it's a fantastic knife. You see a lot of pit masters use this for cutting through brisket too, because they got to get through that top crust and then have a nice sharp cut sawing motion. So they'll use this blade where it's going to catch on and then start to do the work for it. So really nice knife. The biggest complaint I get about knives from people, from especially, you know, home cooks and home chefs, is that their knives are dull, and it's, what do I do about this? Now, I'm going to show you a couple different tools for sharpening knives, and the biggest thing is you can use this on steak knives, pocket knives, chef knives, scissors. I don't think there's a single dull blade in my house. And you know, this takes just a few minutes to do. It's super easy. So the first tools we're going to talk about are actually what are called the steels. So I think everyone's familiar with this. It's, you know, the long sharpening pole that comes with most nice knife sets when you buy it. Now, a steel has a little bit of ridges on the side, and what that's going to do is actually help hone the blade of the knife. And just going in a motion like this at about a 30-degree angle of the knife to the blade, just long, smooth strokes. Now, there's a guard at the end too to make sure you're not hitting your fingers. But you don't want to come through and go super fast, because let's face it, if you miss, you're still going to nick your knuckle or your thumb. So you just do slow motions. But this alone won't sharpen your knife adequately, and that's the big thing. Now, there is another type of steel that will, that I love and I use a lot, and it's called the diamond steel. And the diamond steel has two flatter sides. It's still a little bit curved. But what the diamond steel does, it has a very, very fine powder coating. So if I were to come in and sharpen, and I don't know if you can hear the difference on that, but sharpening this on here, it does more than just hone it. If I were to take a dull knife and actually just pay attention with this on the diamond steel and go at this for a few minutes, and this, just like the other one, has a guard at the end. If you look closely, you can see we've nicked that guard several times. This is actually going to sharpen the knife, which is great. Now, the diamond steel, like I said, these run about $30. They're not very expensive when you consider the fact that you can just pull this out of your drawer, sharpen a knife real quick. After you do it, you just want to give the knife a nice little wipe, because there's always a little bit of metal residue because you're shaving down metal on your knife. But it's a great tool to have, and I recommend everyone pick up a diamond steel. Like I said, $25, $30, really awesome. Sharpening stones are very much like sandpaper, and if you're familiar with buying sandpaper, you know that use a coarser sandpaper for rougher jobs, use a finer sandpaper for nice, smoother jobs. Well, this stone here is called an oil stone, and the oil stone has three sides. It has the rough side, the medium side, and then the super fine side, the smooth side. And what this does is, if I were to take the Nakiri here, which, like I said, is very dull, I'm going to add a little bit of an oil to my rag and just oil up the stone, because you don't want to do this on a dry stone. That's going to create a lot of friction, and it's going to scratch up your knife. So if there's a little oil on it, it's definitely going to help. And then I like to put this under here just to keep this from moving. And then on a 30-degree angle, I take my fingers and place them on here and just gently run my knife in the length and direction of the blade. I do this on both sides, and I'm not applying much pressure. It's a very smooth pressure. If I were to try to muscle this down, all I'm going to do is hurt the blade, or I'm just going to keep pushing metal, and as the metal starts to heat up and sharpen, the blade's actually going to start to curve to one point. We don't want that. We need a nice, smooth blade. So you do, call it 10 on each side with this. And then, if I wanted to take this to the next level, I turn this, okay, and I'm going to oil this side up as well. And this is the medium grade. So this is going to actually start to fine tune and sharpen the side that we already started on. Same thing, okay? Now you're going to hear it doesn't, if you were doing this, you'll see it doesn't have the same kind of resistance as the other one did, which is great. And then going to the last one, as I'm getting, this is actually getting very sharp, it's great. So it doesn't take a long time to do. So going to the last one now, grease this guy up too, and you can see this has a lot more grit on it, soot, because this one actually does the final buffing, so it's going to clean up all the residual stuff that's on here, but also gets you that super, super sharp side. And you want to make sure you're doing full strokes in the length of the knife. This is really important, because this is what's going to give you a nice, even blade. So a smaller option, you might have one of these or have seen these. This is called a diamond stone. So same principle as the diamond steel, but it's smaller and it's flatter, so you can treat it like a stone. You normally need some sort of a wet towel underneath because it'll move on you. But if I were to take this, it's moving, see? And do the same kind of thing where I'm sharpening. And these diamond steels are great for, the stones are great for scissors, stuff like that. You can see as I'm sharpening, it sharpens pretty quickly. But this isn't much different than this. Now, even when I fully stone sharpen my knives, I still come back with my diamond steel and give them a little bit of love. And the reason is you just want to get that final little cleanup on your knife. And the big thing is, this is the way I hold my knife, right? I don't hold my knife like this when I'm sharpening it. I hold it like this when I'm cutting. So when I go like this, I'm doing that final little polish in the direction of how I'd be using my knife regularly. So it kind of just finishes smoothing out the knife. Now, when I look at my knife, your knife has 3 parts to it, and people don't realize it. You have the heel. This is kind of the business side. This is where the strength, because if you think about it, this is the part of your knife that hits the board the most. This is also the part that's going to dull the fastest, but it has the most pressure because it's closest to your hand. The middle part is your general slicing. So if I'm slicing, I'm usually using the middle part of my knife here, see? And then I'm tapping down on this part here. But if you notice, this very tip isn't really getting used. And that's because this part will stay the sharpest on your knife, and this is for finesse cuts. If I were to take this carrot and I just wanted to cut ring cuts, right? I would just come with the middle of the knife straight down, okay? Now, if I wanted to then take these ring cuts and cut them into something a little finer, where I wanted more control, I would use the finesse side of my knife and come in like this and do little slices. And that gives me a lot more control. It's also a lot sharper because it's, like I said, it's touching the cutting board the least. So you can take and actually just run your knife through and do a nice little mince all with the same knife. Carrot confetti. Now, if I have big giant carrots, I need to get through this fat part of them. I'm going to use the heel of the knife to cut through. And that makes it so easy, because if I'm using the middle or I'm trying to use the tip, I'm wobbling. And then as it comes through when I'm wobbling, if my thumb isn't where it should be or my finger isn't where it should be, which means tucked and on top of the food, well then that's coming right for it. So using the heel controls and goes through right nice and easy. If I go like this through from the front, I'm pushing more. I'm using more force, which means more chance to slip, more chance of hurting yourself. The Nakiri knife, in the same regard, can be used for other things as well, like fancier cutting. If I wanted to round this carrot out more, the Nakiri just navigates really nicely around the carrot to give me something like a perfect tube of a carrot. Perfect-ish. I haven't done that in a while. That's kind of the basics of these knives with cutting. Another question that I think every chef gets all the time is, hey, can you teach me how to cut an onion? I said, sure, when I learn how, you can learn how. Your onion has 2 sides, right? You have the root side, which is where that little core is, and a lot of people like to remove that right away. I like to keep it in because it's going to help us keep the onion together as we're cutting it. And then you have the top where the sprout would come out of. Both of those parts have been shaved down. And then we peeled the onion. Now what I'm going to do is actually cut the onion in half. And to do that, I'm going to use the middle of the knife, like I said, because it's not a heavy, strong root like a carrot, so you can go through kind of easily and glide, but I also need to be able to move the motion. To cut the onion, then, I'm going to use the fine part of my knife, and I'm going to put my fingertips up and actually do a gliding, sawing motion in here, okay? And I'm coming about 3/4 of the way through. And now, as you can see, my onion's kind of like this, where there's some room. I'm going to take the same part of my knife and come straight down. And the size I want my dice is going to depend on how I do these lines here. And last step is using the middle part of the knife. I'm just going to come through and glide down. And now in no time at all, you have a nice diced onion. So the last thing is, what do you do with this core, right? Use the tip of your knife, come down the same way you did, come this way, one last time, and there you go. You're all diced up for the onion. Now when you're slicing, okay, your knife is set up with a curve, with a natural curve here, okay? And that's important because you're going to use your knife in that motion, see, like a locomotion. So I always tell people, when you're cutting, you want to make sure that the tip of your knife, especially for smaller things, is touching the board, because that's going to give you fluidity. You know, it's going to let you keep moving quickly. So when you do that and you just keep moving, you're adjusting by scooting slightly with the knife, and then you're keeping your fingers tucked, so you're moving back with it as well. And it's all that fluid motion. So that's kind of the basics of knife skills and knives and what I kind of use every single day. Now I have a ton of these knives, but the main 3 knives I use every day are my chef knife, my utility knife, and my Nakiri. These are kind of my 3 extensions of my hands at all times. I always have those 3 knives and my diamond steel with me, and that's basically all you really need. Now the paring knives, they're great, they're convenient. Length of a chef knife depends on you. If you like a longer knife and you're more comfortable with a longer knife like I am, then get one. My wife at home, she uses I think it's an 8-inch chef's knife. She loves it. It's comfortable. She has smaller hands. She can maneuver it better. I like bigger knives. It just works better for me. It's what I've always used. But one other fun thing, I've had this knife. This is the Shun Classic. This is the very first knife I ever invested in and bought. And you can see that the logo is actually gone from it. That's how long I've had it. But this knife has lasted me this long. And because of the sharpening, the blade's gotten a little bit thinner. It still holds its sharpness, stays sharp. It does everything I need it to do. It's very well balanced. I love this knife. I think the Shun Classic of this was around $180, $190. So they're an investment, but if you maintain them and you take care of them, it's a lot cheaper than getting stitches. So something to think about. A sharp knife will cut you less often than a dull one will. But thank you. Any questions you guys have, leave them in the comments. I'll get back to you. Thank you all for watching. That is my basics on knife skills. Have a great day.